Well, hi, my name's David Aleph, and this Affable Life, which is our community building podcast. I have a very interesting and perhaps unusual interview today. I'm interviewing an outback nurse who works in emergency at a regional hospital. I happen to have known this nurse since the very day she was born. And she and her family were part of a religious cult that I was part of. Some of my friends know, some of you may know, that I spent some 21 years. My family spent that amount of time with me as part of that fundamentalist Christian cult. So it's been interesting to talk to Roie Caine today. She has a lot to say, and very shortly I'll be releasing the audio version of the book my brother and I wrote, called My Brother's Eyes. John and I recorded it probably 3 years ago, something like that. I haven't really checked, and I've sort of been very tardy about getting it published. You'll probably understand why as you listen to the interview and see the interview today. I'm very grateful to Roie for the time she's spent with me. I'm sure you're going to be quite intrigued by this quite amazing young lady. Thank you. Well, now today I'm interviewing someone that I've known for quite a long time, really. In fact, I think I've known this lady, Roie. I think I've known you all your life, which means that you've known me longer than I've known you.
Be about 37 years now.
Yes. I'm not even sure that I may not have been in a certain hospital when you were born, but not by the bedside, I can assure you. Your mother would not have approved of that.
I don't think so, no.
And I think your father would have probably been very upset.
No, I don't think he would have been very impressed.
No, not at all. And I think I was there when your two brothers were born too. So now, do you, when I say that I think you know me, have known me longer than I've known you, do you know why I say that?
Well, I think I've known you. You've always been a big part of my life and growing up too, and been a big part of your family, and you've been a big part of ours. And I guess I've got to watch you even as a child and as an adult grow as well. Kind of cool.
Thank you. Is that your dog making noise in the background?
Yeah, it's my dog sitting on her bed. Okay.
And I've got a dog next door that is barking every now and then, but I'm hoping it's not coming through. Now, the reason I say that that you actually know me longer than I've known you is because when you think about it, you've known me all your life, and I've only known you for a part of mine.
True story.
Now, why is that, Roie? I'll let you answer the questions. I wrote a book a few years ago with my brother called My Brother's Eyes, which told a particular story. So how come we've known each other for so long?
My family was part of this cult that you wrote about. My mum and dad grew as young adults, and I grew up in that cult. So from the time I was born until I was about 13 or 14, that's all I ever knew. And your family and my family were particularly close in Sydney. We lived not that far a walk away. And I have some quite pretty amusing memories of you and Dad and skateboarding and riding push bikes down that hill. And Meg telling people to go outside and bleed outside.
Oh, we perhaps should qualify that. That was my wife Meg, who is a nurse, and she was very caring and is still very caring. But if somebody was cut themselves or something and they were going to bleed on the floor, she'd always be very practical as a nurse, which you'd understand now, Roie. And she'd say, go outside and bleed on the grass or something.
And we weren't allowed to bleed on the concrete. It had to be on the grass.
Exactly.
Which I can totally understand. Don't bleed in my house.
Yeah. So really, your growing up years, which I'm very aware of, were fairly restricted. Where were you educated?
So until I was in high school, I was educated in homeschooling. So my very first years of primary school, we went to somebody's house and we had a group of us, a small group of about 8 or 9 kids, and then we moved out to the country, into the Southern Highlands, and we expanded to about 12 or 13 kids, and then we kind of had like a part of a shed that was like a schoolhouse and very similar to a classroom, I suppose, other than it was kind of, I suppose, what you would imagine in a very small country town where you had kids from, say, kindergarten right the way through to high school, and it was a composite kind of thing, but we had regular school hours and homework and all the other stuff that went with schooling, I suppose. Just we didn't have kids that we didn't know, and it was the kids that we grew up with, and we didn't know anyone else, so it was a very close-knit community.
It was a fundamentalist Christian group, but it had one particular thing that set it apart from other fundamentalist Christian groups, and that was a belief that the founder, who was a woman, was God, which is a bit absurd, don't you think?
Thinking back on it now, yes, it is very absurd, and I really struggle with that concept of thinking that you're Holy Spirit reincarnated. And as a nurse now, I kind of look at it and go, psychosis or some sort of severe mental health disorder.
Yeah.
But as a child, that was all I ever knew. So it was just accepted in the same way that the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus would be accepted for normal children, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And when Violet died, and I obviously told this story in the book, which will soon be available as an audiobook and an ebook, because my brother and I recorded it a few years ago. And I've got to say to you that it's really not my favourite story, which I think you might understand.
No, but I think that it's given, especially my generation of the children that grew up, a context as adults to understand what happened to us as children too. And I think it came, for me personally, it came with understanding and the ability to go and seek healing and recovery.
Wonderful, wonderful. And that, you were one of the first who said to me things like that when the book came out. I know it did cause some pain to some folk, and I recognise that, because after you've been in a wacky religious group, and not even that, but everybody was so close. This was like a real family. We were obliged to cut off our flesh and blood family and friends, and so our whole world was within this one group.
Yeah, absolutely. Like for me, like the people like you and other older adults, they become auntie and uncles, and the older generation again became pseudo grandparents, and so we still had that family environment that you would normally have. It was just they weren't blood family, I suppose.
Absolutely. And so when something closes, and I found myself in charge of the group after God died. I don't know whether you know, but I really had to think about it, because if you're following on after God, right, there's a possibility that you could become God, I guess. I don't know. It's a bit of an
True. Kind of like promotion by what do you call it? Like, you get promotion by death, I suppose, or
something like that.
retirement.
Yeah. But I looked at my talents my abilities and my weaknesses, and, you know, thought about a resume that I might put together. And I thought, no, I just don't think I add up to this, really. No, that's a joke. But and there was, I don't think there was any possibility of that kind of belief happening around me, thankfully. But I was in charge, and after a few years, we had, I think, some fun times over, you know, with horses and cattle and different businesses that we had, and I think the lives of the younger people like yourself, Roie, were very different to when Violet was alive, a bit more liberated. And then the day came that we sort of looked at the beliefs we had and made the decision just to let it all go. We believed there was a load of rubbish. I use stronger words these days. And we renounced it all. And at that time, everybody was on the same page, which was extraordinary, because it was your father who said to me, had I made these revelations about, you know, the falseness of what we were believing, and people had given their houses and they'd given up careers and everything to follow this woman. Had I made that revelation to everybody, I think a year or two before, your father said, we probably would have lynched you. So the timing was kind of good.
And I agree. And I think that, I think the timing, I think the adults of the group, whether they were part of the smaller group that ran the cult or not, needed that time of separation after Violet died, and still have that community and connectedness to come to grips with their own truths. Whether that was true for us younger kids, although we, like you said, enjoyed some liberative things and we had outside people coming in and stuff. In my family, it wasn't, I don't think Mum and Dad really talked about liberation and the possibility that this was all a huge ruse and quite false, and that they'd been led down the wrong path. So that, I think that moment of when it all kind of fell apart and disbanded, I remember it distinctly. I was just before I was 13, and my dad just came down from the top half of the house, the property, and sat me out on the fence and just basically said, oh, well, it's all over and you're going to school at the local high school the next week. And at that age, I don't think I had the capacity to understand completely, and all I understood was my entire life and everything up until that point was a lie, and now off you go into the real world. And that was quite traumatizing, I suppose. There was no explanation for it. I don't think Dad even had the capacity to understand or explain in any other way, any other terms, and I didn't have the capacity to understand either. All I knew is that most of the kids that were my age in this rural community didn't like us very much, and although I was excited to go to a normal school, I could definitely see there was going to be some massive issues with that, and didn't really understand at the time how my life was going to change quite dramatically in the next 6 months. I suppose, you know, we lived a life of, although what I would consider not very luxurious, but now things definitely financially got and emotionally got much more difficult in probably a year or two post that stage as well. And I think that changed who I was as a person quite dramatically in that 12-month period.
I think the unfortunate thing was, at the time that, you know, we had that big meeting and I sort of asked everybody to come together and made those revelations, or the big revelation, you know, the reality is that nobody...
Sorry, that's the dog barking.
That's all right. What's the name of the dog?
Cherry.
Cherry. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. He's allowed to bark. The time that I made that sort of big revelation that it was a load of crap, right? And didn't use that word or others that I might use now. I don't think anybody was equipped to know what to do, how to deal with it. And there was nowhere that you could go to get help, really. I mean, even today, and I've been involved with a group called Cult Information and Family Support for, I suppose, 15 years or something like that, maybe longer, I'm not sure. And I do try and help people who come out of different cults as much as I can, but I'm limited, I think, emotionally, but also I'm limited with my work and family and so on as to what I can do. But I've just been able to listen to someone and hear their story and understand is a big step. Now, so, you know, your parents, my wife and I, others, all were in the same boat, and your kids were all in the same boat. You know, who's going to talk to you? Who's going, like, the next week you went to school, and I could have included my own adult kids in this interview as well, but I chose not to because I thought it might have been, and I can do it again later, but thought it might be a bit too embarrassing for them. And I was really glad that you're happy to talk. We are going to talk about nursing. We're not finished yet.
No, that's okay.
But I just thought it'd be good to go back into background a little bit. The point I'm coming to is that going to school the next week, a public school, you've already said that local kids didn't like you, and that was probably because you were different, you know, and you couldn't mix with them in the normal way. I don't know what it was. What do you think it was?
I think the biggest challenge that not only myself, but I think all the other kids that were my age group and went from that homeschooling environment to our local schools was that we didn't have any social skills.
Yeah.
We didn't. No one had, you know, most kids at the age of kind of like 2 or 3 go to play groups or, and as they get older in kindergarten, they learn to make friends and what's socially acceptable and what's not, and how to go up to someone and say hello, and how all those kind of social norms that most kids grow up, and it's just a part of their learning process right from very young. That's something that none of us had an opportunity to do, and that made it very difficult. You know, we didn't know how to make friends. We didn't know what was socially acceptable and what wasn't. On the upside, we'd been very sheltered from bullying and that kind of behaviour, and that was never acceptable. And then to go from a very sheltered environment where bullying and you know, you knew the people, you'd grown up with the people that were around you, and having that support to kids that, or an environment where bullying was acceptable, and not knowing who to go to or how to resolve that conflict yourself, or and you know, things like, well, going and speaking to an adult about it actually made the situation worse rather than better. And I think for probably more than just myself, it resulted in resorting to violence or drugs or mental health issues later on. Well, from there, that's where that kind of started, and really struggling through our teenage years into early adulthood. And that, I think it took most of us until probably our early to mid-20s to actually find our feet and kind of be able to develop those skills that we had deficits in lots of different ways, especially social aspect ways. And I think that took us probably most of our high school years, or even after that, to be able to develop those skills that we now, I suppose, would be normal adults.
We go down a lot more down the line of talking about this sort of thing, but and I'm really grateful that you're happy to talk about it, Roie. I still have in the back of my mind that releasing the new audiobook and the ebook and so on may bring more pain to some others. I hope most people have moved on enough that that won't be the case. One of the reasons for telling the story initially was so that people could learn. Not only us, the people from the group, but there are so many funny, strange, wacky groups around the world of people who believe that what we believe is right and everybody else is wrong. And there are governments who even act like that as well, aren't there?
Absolutely. And I think too that, like, as I suppose probably in the last 5 or 10 years, being able to heal and open up and actually say to people, hey, I kind of grew up in this weird environment. Other people have come forward and say, hey, I grew up in this kind of cult or this kind of similar environment. And knowing that you're not the only person and you're not alone, and you can have, although I have a very small select group of people that I share that particular in childhood experience with, there are others out there that have similar experiences, and that connection through trauma and subsequent healing through that is quite a powerful, quite a powerful thing. And for them to know that they're not alone either. And I've made some really good friendships through people that have had similar experiences, maybe through exclusive brethren or Jehovah's Witnesses or something like that, that although circumstances were different, the emotional experience is still the same.
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, I've got to tell you, I'm so proud of you for the things that you've achieved through your life, knowing, you know, you had some difficult years, which lots of people have, but hey, you know, with coming out of that background, as well-meaning as all of us as parents were, we made some dreadful mistakes by our choices and the belief system that we had signed up to. But no, you've really proven yourself extraordinarily. And you know, I was amazed initially when you joined the Navy. At what age?
I was just after I turned 17, so I was 17 at that age.
Wow.
And I think that was, looking back on it now, that was a whole kind of rebellion and that finding myself and testing out my independence. And I think one thing from all this out of my childhood was that, and I see it in everybody else, especially the people that are my age, is resilience. We're incredibly strong people, and telling us that we can't do something, or we're not smart enough, or we're not good enough, or we're not in the right social class just doesn't mean much to us, and we just go and do it anyway.
Fantastic, fantastic. And that is true. You know, the toughness breeds toughness, tough experiences. I mean, you can go the other way. And there was a saying, I don't know who started it off, but it was used in religious circles, I think, which says you can turn your scars into stars. And, you know, you either are pulled down by your experiences so that, you know, you never can achieve much in your own life and you're always looking back, or you build on those experiences and you suddenly become, you know, someone perhaps much more achieving than you would have been without that difficult background. So going to school initially, a public school, would have been a huge challenge. I'm not quite sure how you would have managed that.
Traumatizing, I think, is an experience, and like later on in life, being able to have that opportunity to talk to my mum especially and say, you know, this was going on at the school, or this was going on. Some of it she knew and some of it she didn't, and I think I kept a lot of it to myself, and I think it's made me who I am today, and a lot stronger and a lot more self-reliant, and very much careful of who my friends are, and I choose. I think I made better choices of friends as I grow older than I probably could have without that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next thing, you've just talked about joining the Navy. I mean, that must have been a real eye-opener for you,
Um,
or not?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it was kind of like that flow-on effect of going from very restrictive to having a bit more freedom, and then we moved to Kiama. That gave me a bit more freedom, and then it gave me an opportunity to grow up and mature in a relatively safe environment. And I know,
Good.
like, most people would go, well, the military is not very a safe environment, but it still gave me those rules and structure,
Right.
and communal living environment that I really craved.
Yeah.
Um, but still having an income and being independent also. And yeah, probably did go a bit off the rails, but it was definitely something that I look back on and go, it was an adventure and it was exciting, and finding that love of adventure and love for travel and that kind of seeing the world, and well, not just the world, but seeing the country and meeting different types of people. And like, up until I was that age group, you know, I really hadn't had very much exposure to gay and lesbian, or, you know, that kind of environment. And then that all of a sudden became just a normal part, because it was so normalized in the military. It became such a normal part of my life, and I kind of went, oh, well, you're gay, so what, you know, and really got to know people for who they were, not their sexual orientation, and made me very much more open and considerate as a person.
So would you say that, and this is just an interesting observation, I'm just interested, you say that you know, you being in the Navy made you more open and more understanding, and, you know, so somebody was gay or lesbian, well, so what, you know, that's fine, that's okay, you know. Back in your growing up years, I mean, obviously you would have been a child, but views would have been very different in all our households, I think, to those issues. We wouldn't have seen that as normal or acceptable, in my view, back in those days. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And like, my uncle was gay, and he lived in our household, and that was never spoken of. And now I look back, even though he's passed away now, you know, he made great attempts to be socially acceptable, and having, you know, a girlfriend, or seemed to be having a girlfriend, or having what they call presumed to be a socially acceptable job, or, you know, filling his lot. And I'm really glad that it fell apart before, on some level, he was forced to have children or something like that. That would have been totally soul destroying for him. And I think it was not until I was probably 17 or 8, actually, it was probably when I moved out of home and went to the military, that I actually understood that he was gay. And you know, my mum would, I'd say to mum, no, this, you know, he's gay, and mum's like, no, he's just a bit strange. And I'm going, no, the dude's gay, like. And I understood that, and like, for the first time in my life, I actually understood that, you know, he liked men, and that was okay. And to follow on from that, my brother then came out much, you know, quite a few years later, and said that he was gay too. And I was able to support him through that. And I think I was the first person that he ever, I remember him saying to me, oh, I think I'm bisexual. And I'm looking at him going, are you kidding me? Like, okay. And being able to then relate those experiences, my uncle, to my brother, and go, and I kind of let him kind of say, oh, well, I'm bisexual for a bit. And then one day he just kind of rang me on the phone and said, I'm gay. And I went, well, duh, I know. And he's like, well, how do you know? You're the first person I've told. And I went, well, I've known since you were about 3 or 4. And that was okay to me. And I think that safety in having a family member that was accepting no matter what was really important to him too.
Yeah, I think it was, and your brother, your uncle. I tried also to be supportive to your brother, but your uncle. It's one of the great sadnesses of my life when I think back on how damaged his life was because of having to grow up in an environment that was not accepting of who he was. And it held him back so much because he was such a brilliant man. He could basically do anything. He went on and did some wonderful artwork and so on. But, the career
Yeah, I got to know him too in probably the last 7 years of his life too. And although he was a recluse, and I think that was just his personality, he was a painful introvert, but he did have happiness and peace in his life, and he did things that he loved, and he had a group of friends, even though they were quite small, a close knit group of friends and a community, and was able to be himself, and to see that and to share that part of his community with me through university and being intellectual. And I had a great relationship with him probably over the last 7 years of his life of these amazing intellectual conversations. And my husband, got to meet him, and there's quite a funny story about that, and taking us to a pub near where he lived in Sydney, and I walked in, I was the only female, and my husband was the only straight male, and they were having their monthly meeting of the Bears Association, and my husband looks clearly like a straight bear, and having that enjoyment and being able to sit and have a beer with him, and having this hilarious discussion was something that that I kind of hang on to, and there's some really happy memories that, although he was very unwell, was able to share that experience with him.
Wonderful. And I'm sure that you were a great, not only a great support, but a great friend to your uncle. Now, Roie, I want to move on to some of the other things that you achieved. So I'm really glad that the Navy experience was good for you, and hopefully you didn't run into any bullying or sort of bad stuff there.
No, not in the Navy. No, I kind of discovered social grouping and became part of that kind of, I suppose, if you want to put it in school terms, that cool group, and that was actually quite an enjoyable and fun part of my young adult life.
Good. Now that's wonderful. Then you went on. Now, I'm going to jump up to the present, because you've done other things. You left the Navy, and what sort of work did you do for a few years?
I went on and I worked in the industry, so the civilian industry, working with military and outdoors, and with boats and kind of a trade industry. After that, I went on and studied a Bachelor of Psychology and a Bachelor of Criminology, and then went into working in the mental health and drug and alcohol industry, and then further on into that with traumatised kids.
Wow. And that's amazing stuff that you've done, you and your husband, in that area. But there you are, you had this homeschool environment. The education system we used back then in that farm community was accelerated Christian education. And I think they found a way to put a Bible verse into every single aspect of education.
Absolutely. Moses had 12 commandments. If you broke it in half, how many commandments did you get?
Yeah, wonderful stuff. But anyway, so then you've gone on, and the thinking within that group originally was that you don't need education past so many years. You don't need university. You don't need, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why today I'm very passionate about groups like, for example, the Exclusive Brethren that run their own schools and prevent their children from aspiring to be doctors, nurses.
Absolutely. I think that education there was not enough value on education, and basic education was enough because the women were going to be housewives and do menial, telemetry jobs or whatever, typing jobs, and the men were going to work on the farm or have, be a builder or, have some sort of trade. And there was no, for those of us that actually felt like we wanted to be educated further, I think it was very much squashed. And to be able to go on and have that education afterwards is, I think we've had, like most of us have gone on to a university or a trade education, and we value that further education so much more than I suppose most people would.
When I look at what others of your peers have achieved, different ones on Facebook and so on, it's quite amazing what each of them have done. And, one would hope that they're continuing to build very, positive lives. And, because I was the pastor at that time after God died, but it took me a few years to change my thinking because you're already brainwashed into this way of thinking. And whilst I was trying to, open the doors and do the perestroika thing that they did in Russia, openness, there were still limits in my thinking. And I remember with my older son, who you know very well, one point somebody said to me he'd make a great lawyer. And I immediately thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Yeah, okay. But that sort of was one of the ways of opening my thinking. And so each of our kids have gone on and done wonderful things. Now, so you had 2 degrees, right, at that stage?
Yes.
And in your very young age, in your early 30s or mid 30s, you decided to become a nurse.
So I'd moved from Western Australia to the east coast of Australia after a domestic violence relationship, and moved in with my now husband, and his mother was terminally ill with cancer, and ended up looking after her for quite a few years, and always wanted to do nursing, always had an interest in nursing and science, and I was always that person that was like, I wonder what's in the back of that ambulance, or I wonder what's behind those doors, and had some experience of nursing and mental health in the jobs that I'd done previously, and really wanted to pursue that. And so when my mother-in-law passed away, I enrolled. My husband and I were homeless. We were living in my parents' newly finished caravan, and enrolled in my nursing degree. And about a week later, they said, "Yep, sure, no worries, we'll let you in." And so moved again from the Gold Coast down to the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, to some safer accommodation, and the university that I was going to was there as well, and found work and jobs, and went through and did my nursing degree.
Wonderful. So how long did that take you, Roie?
It was a 3-year degree full time.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked almost full time as well while I did that. So it could range from 3 or 4 days a week, a couple of hours a day at university, but a lot of it was at home and a lot of study, and it required, a lot of sacrifices. Both my husband and I, even though we were working, I didn't have much time to spend with friends or downtime. There was a lot of study involved, and I probably did a lot more than lots of other people, but that was my standards that I'd set for myself. And I kind of, when I started the degree, I kind of looked around the room and wanted to be in the kind of top 100 people that graduated, and then the second year it was kind of like the top 50 people, and then by the third year I was kind of battling for the first place position with 2 or 3 other people, and ended up walking out with that Dux position, which was massive for me, especially to
Huge.
kind of look back on and go, that's where I'd come from, and that kind of childhood where education wasn't valued, and to be able to have that value for myself, to achieve that.
That's wonderful. Is that your dog again?
It is. She wants to come in, but she's going to stay outside. Ah! She can go around. Okay.
Thank you. So, Roie, you then applied for a position in a rather remote area. We won't say exactly where, but it was a pretty tough gig that you were applying for. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I lived in a regional area of Australia, and very early on I realised that I had no interest in big city hospitals or that kind of nursing, and I wanted to do rural remote emergency nursing, and the place to get that was I'd kind of had a bit of a chat to some other people in the industry, and kind of, as I do, decided that if I was going to go for a job, I may as well go for the most ridiculous out there job at the top of the pile. And the place that I applied for 2 places, one of which I'm working at now, and the other one was Thursday Island, which I also applied for, and actually got the job and had to choose between where I am now on Thursday Island, and couldn't afford to move to Thursday Island because it was quite a considerable amount of money to relocate up there. But ended up in a relatively small community in the middle of the desert.
And just before the coronavirus hit.
It did, and kind of it was about 1,500 kilometres of relocation to get from where I was to where I am now. I think the second day I was there on the floor, we had a gentleman pull up to our ambulance department, and one of our junior doctors went out to go and have a look at him and kind of called for help and got a wheelchair and wheeled him in, and he was pouring sweat, was this funky shade of very wrong colour, and was having a massive heart attack. And kind of like second day on the job, I'm going, oh my God, I don't really know what to do. But know that, this is a pretty life-threatening experience. And then kind of being forced to, well, there's only a few of you in the department. We only have 3 nurses on, and generally at any one given time, and only a couple of doctors. And so every set of hands, is needed. Oh, there's the dog's leg in the way. Every set of hands needed, and being expected to know what to do even when you don't, and kind of in that situation. And I think there's been cases where, where we do have critically unwell people come in. It's very different because we don't have a specialist to just come in, wander in. We have to make do with what we've got, and limited resources and limited personnel, and everybody has more than one job, and everyone from our clerks, our clerks do CPR, and even the most junior nurses do far more than what you would expect somebody that has been in a city hospital for 10 or more years, and you might only be 2 or 3 months into practicing, but you're expected to do that kind of stuff. And I think it brings a skill set and a toughness, and it brings your team together. We only have a very small team that we work with. There's only I think a total of like 11 or 12 nurses and 5 doctors in total that we work with all the time. And so you become very close-knit and learn to rely on each other, and each person has their own set of skill sets that's utilised regularly.
Mm. That's pretty amazing. And just finally, I mean, I'd love to do this again at some point, Roie, you know, when you've been there for a while, and we can talk more about, you know, particularly the nursing. But the other thing, what's the talk? How do you and your colleagues feel about this coronavirus thing that has people isolated in their homes, and it's quite scary?
I think on one hand, we can be very frustrated by people who don't do the right thing.
Yeah.
It can be very frustrating, especially when people go, the complaints of, oh, I'm stuck at home and I'm bored, and we're like kind of going, well, please stay there because you're keeping us safe and you're keeping us well, because we can't do that. And then the other side of it, we're still human and we're very much like everybody else, and we're quite afraid. And unfortunately for us, we know a lot more than the general public.
Yeah.
And when you start to see doctors and nurses very concerned, then you all should be very, very concerned.
Absolutely.
I think being in such an isolated population, you know, when our closest town is, you know, 250 kilometres away, and the closest major city is 600 or 700 kilometres away, has given us some advantage. But it definitely has its disadvantages too, because we don't have the opportunity to get extra staff in, or we don't have the opportunity of being able to just take somebody to a major hospital when we're full.
Yeah.
Because that just is not possible. We're working longer hours and we're working much harder, and our resources are much more limited than our city counterparts, but then we're not seeing the amount of cases that our city counterparts are seeing either. So I think having such a small community out here, we've all kind of banded together, and we're quite open about our concerns with our management, and our management are really quite good about supporting us and networking within each other, and all working together to find some sort of solution, whether it works or not.
Yeah.
Which I think is better than a big city hospital, where you wouldn't have that opportunity to be a part of the planning and the implementation of those kind of processes. That's a responsibility right from people like me to the CEO and upper management and doctors, senior doctors. We have access to that, I suppose, and we're a part of that process, which I feel like is more inclusive and better than it could be in the city. It's more responsibility, but you feel like you're having a bigger part in keeping everybody safe.
Yes, and
than you would in a big city hospital.
And no doubt you have the feeling that you can use your talents and, you know, contribute in a more positive way.
Absolutely. The opportunity to upskill, it is not so much of a nice to have out here, it's a necessity.
Yeah.
And so even somebody like me I'm now having opportunity to upskill into high dependency and ICU unit.
Yep.
Kind of skill set that you wouldn't have until you're probably 6 or 7 years out of university. Which is massive. Last
question. There's a difficult one for you, and thank you very much for being so open throughout all of this. Roie, how's your stocks of dunny paper?
We're not too bad. We did find a bit of a stash from when we moved. I opened a box a couple of weeks ago and it was full of dunny paper, and I went, hallelujah. But we may need to utilise our healthcare specific Tuesday and Thursday 1 hour shopping morning to go and get some more shortly.
What about, are there any shortages? Because there are some parts of Australia that are suffering shortages because of the city crazies.
No, the country out here in the country, they're just as crazy. And yes, there is a lot of shortage. And I think, unlike our city counterparts, I think the biggest impact we felt is that we can't just go to the next suburb or to suburb over to get supplies that you can't find in your own suburb. You know, our next major town is a 5 hour drive away.
Wow.
And we can't do that because it's in a different state.
Yep.
So that makes things challenging, and you just kind of have to work together. And I noticed, like, you know, if somebody finds in our ED, one of our staff gets a 20 pack, then it will be shared with the people that don't have any or very little. And our resources are being shared in our own workplace, our own personal resources, you know, food and gunning paper and those kind of things are being shared amongst ourselves that wouldn't normally happen, I suppose.
Well, no, that's wonderful. That's actually a really good thing. Well, look, thanks very much for this, and we'll obviously we'll talk again, whether we record it or not. We'll talk again.